Thank you for the invitation, both Savi and Chris. I'm excited to talk here today. So I'm going to talk about work that we're doing that's all computational, focused on excitonic properties of organic assemblies. And mainly our interest is in understanding solar energy conversion better. And I'm going to talk about these stacked perylenene diamides as a model system to understand exciton delocalization and exciton dynamics in stacked molecular assemblies. So we know that in systems where the molecules are stacked in an ordered way, whether it's in the bulk or in arrays, that there's going to be a significant influence of intermolecular orientation and interaction on the optoelectronic characteristics. So whether it's electronic coupling or vibrational coupling, it can affect the nature of the excited states and also their dynamics, and in the case of optical excitation, conversion to other, for example, in singlet fission or in solar cells. So what we'd like to understand is how do those intermolecular interactions, how can we sort of have some physical intuition for them or somehow control them? So when I was a postdoc back a few years ago in Jeff Neaton's group at Berkeley Lab, we looked at the role of long-range order on the excitonic properties of bulk organics. So I'm showing here the case of pentacene, where we have these 5 fused benzene rings, and we have the frontier orbitals or pi-like orbitals. And when we put them into a bulk crystal, what we see is that we have pi-pi interactions in the crystal, and we can get delocalization of the exciton. So this is an image to show that, and we basically see that the exciton delocalizes over about 10 molecules or so. And we can do some analysis of this wave function to determine the charge transfer characteristics, which can again be important for conversion, and we found that it was about 50% charge transfer character. So we could understand this physically because we have these organic molecules that are packed in a solid, and there's pi orbitals are interacting so that electrons are able to delocalize, and they can gain in energy by reducing their kinetic energy when they delocalize. Also, when we have a singlet excitation, there is an exchange interaction between electrons and holes, which leads to charge transfer characteristics. So given this understanding, we then looked at how we can change the intermolecular orientation and change the nature of the exciton. So for example, going face to face, we can get this 1D type exciton. And if we start to move molecules apart from each other, we can localize that exciton and change its charge transfer characteristics. And again, this is just the interplay of these different energetic components with the delocalization, the exchange, and also Coulomb interactions. So one question that was really heavy on our minds then and is still heavy on our minds is what happens when we have atomic vibrations, because all of these calculations that we did were for an equilibrium structure without considering zero-point motion or any effect of finite temperature phonons. So that's something that's actually really difficult for us to model for bulk systems, but it's very important for us to understand whether this kind of delocalization will persist and also will be useful when we think about solar energy conversion or exciton dynamics. So that motivated our recent studies from my group looking at these finite stacks of perylenene diamides. So we're working with an experimental group of Alon Gorodetsky who basically attach these perylenene diamide derivatives onto a DNA-like backbone. And because they have pretty good control about where they position these molecules, they can get monomers, dimers, all the way up to tetramers attached on the backbone. And they can purify these molecules, macromolecules in solution and get measurements out of them. So they have very sort of clean samples to work with. And a combination of their measurements and our calculations suggests that we have excited state delocalization in these systems. Molecular dynamics simulations performed by the group of Hung Nguyen indicate that you have this H-like face-to-face stacking, and our calculations suggest that this results in a delocalized electronic state and delocalized excitonic state. Also from the measurements, they find that conductivity through the stacks is length independent, suggesting that there's a coherent transfer of electrons, and also ultra-fast energy transfer of core hole excitations, which we can again explain by delocalization. So this is a nice model system for us to study. And looking at the optical absorption measurements, what we see is that there are strong vibronic effects. So this is for the monomer. We have an onset of absorption here at about 550 nanometers, and then a vibronic replica that is associated with simultaneous excitation of vibrational modes and electronic excitations. When we go to stacks, we see a different shape for the spectrum that seems to be, at least for the dimer and trimer, look very similar to each other, but different from the monomer. So there's something that's happening with stacking. There's a peak reversal, there's a broadening of peaks, and this could be due to different vibronic effects, also different excited states. So this is kind of a nice model system for us to study because we know that atomic vibrations do impact excitons, and we know that there's evidence of exciton delocalization. So now we want to really look at what happens, how do we incorporate those atomic vibrations in our theoretical understanding to understand how they impact delocalization and also dynamics. So we use the time-dependent DFT formalism to describe the excited states, and we describe the vibronic effects with a Frank-Condon-Herzberg-Teller approach. So just as an overview or sort of kind of big picture of what we're doing, we're calculating the potential energy surface in the ground state and in the excited state for a molecule like this stack trimer. And we'd like to be able to describe ground state vibrations as well as excited state vibrations. So an electron can go from any vibrational mode in the ground state into any vibrational mode in the excited state. Because this is still very computationally expensive, we approximate ground state vibrations by doing an ensemble average over many structures extracted from equilibrated molecular dynamics. And we, for each of these structures, we calculate excited state transitions to excited vibrational modes. And we use TDDFT for the electronic excitation using omega B97 XD functional. So when we do these calculations, the first thing that we find is that the ground state vibrational modes are really important because when we extract structures from molecular dynamics, the molecules are slightly rotated with respect to each other. And because the intermolecular orientation so much impacts the optical characteristics, we can get very different optical spectra that we calculate. So this is one example with two different structures that give us two very different vibronically resolved spectra. And then when we also consider the fact that we have stacks of molecules coming together, what we can see is that these stacks have different excited states that are very close in energy, and they all show different vibronic spectra. So this is an example for the tetramer that we have 4 nearly degenerate states that give us very different spectra depending on what initial structure we consider. So what we find is that we need to consider ground state vibrations. We also need to consider multiple excited states. And so when we actually want to compare to the experiment, we take an ensemble average of all the nearly degenerate excited states, all nearly degenerate ground state structures, and we get an averaged optical absorption spectrum. So just to benchmark that method, we compare it to the experiment. So we have some good agreement and some not so good agreement when we compare to experiments. So in terms of good agreement, if we look at the monomer, we get pretty good agreement. For all experiments, we have to redshift slightly to match just because we're not using an exact TDDFT functional. But once we redshift to match the onset of absorption, what we see is that for the monomer, we get a pretty good agreement in terms of peak spacing and oscillator strengths. For the dimer and trimer, we also get a sort of good agreement, general agreement of line shape or peak spacing. But what we see is that this, the onset of absorption, what we find is that the first excited state is dark because we have this H-like stacking, whereas in the experiments, they actually see significant oscillator strength at the onset of absorption. And so we expect that, or we hypothesize that this could be because experiments are done in solution, but more likely is because we have an incomplete description of ground state vibrations, which we saw were so important for describing these optical excitations. So, so while the agreement with experiment is not very, it's not perfect, we feel that this is a good enough agreement to continue on to understand better the excitonic properties of these systems. Because again, our goal is to understand exciton delocalization and how it's impacted by vibrations. So first, just to understand vibrations, here are the vibrational modes that couple strongly to the first excited state, the first excitonic state. So here's for the dimer. And what we see is that for this dark state, or relatively dark state, what we see are these CC sort of stretching modes, kind of benzene breathing modes that are going to couple the strongest to the excited state. But if we look at the bright state, the second excited state, what we see is that intermolecular modes that are the motion, the coherent motion of two molecules together are sort of dominating these coupling to the excited state. And we can see the same for the trimer, that for some excited states, generally the bright one, intermolecular modes couple more strongly. And for generally the darker states, the intramolecular modes couple more strongly. And so what does that mean for our excitonic properties? Well, to sort of get a general understanding of that, what we did was we looked at the electron hole density difference as a measure of exciton delocalization. So at the bottom here, this is for the atoms sort of frozen in at the ground state equilibrium geometry. So we see because of intermolecular interactions, we get some delocalization of the exciton. Now we freeze in those intermolecular modes. So we freeze in a sort of snapshot of that mode. In this case, the sort of coherent motion of molecules. And what we see is that delocalization is maintained. We freeze in the intramolecular CC stretch mode, and we see that the exciton localizes. So although because we have so many different ground state structures and we have so many different excited states, this isn't the case for every single state, but in general, inter PDI or intermolecular modes will maintain the localization of the excited state, whereas intramolecular modes localize. So, because we see in our Frank-Condon analysis that the excited states will couple to both types of excitations, this suggests to us that we might have a mixture of localized and delocalized excitonic states. So how does this actually influence the properties of, for example, solar energy conversion? Well, we should really try and understand the dynamics of excitons and how these vibrational modes can influence them. So to understand exciton dynamics, we started running some simulations using the NextMD code developed by the group of Sergei Tretiak. And here we're looking at non-radiative decay of excitations. So we go from the ground state to a high-lying excited state, and we watch the system decay to the lowest energy excited state. So we're not allowing radiative decay, so we never go back to the ground state. But this kind of gives us an idea of how, once we excite the system, what are the sort of atomic motions that bring us down to the lowest energy state. And here we use a semi-empirical Hamiltonian to describe the excited state and a molecular dynamics to describe the potential energy surfaces. So for the monomer, we excite at the second excited state, and we watch the decay to the first with a 0.6 EV energy difference between the two. And what we see is that this is a slow decay. So we get about half of the excited state is decaying at 860 femtoseconds. And if we look at the charge density or the exciton density and how it's changing over time, it's basically just a pi-like orbital that's sort of changing its oscillator strength or its sort of delocalization a little bit as the atomic the atoms are moving apart. So now if we look at the dimer, and yeah, another point I should make is that these types of motions that we're seeing in the monomer are these sort of CC breathing modes, which we saw were Frank Condon active as well. So now if we look at the dimer, and we excite again to the second excited state, which is much closer to energy than the first because we have this sort of coupling of two molecules now. What we see is a much faster decay from the second excited state to the first. And we see these two different sort of time scales, a really rapid one where 50% of the excited state decays at about 26 femtoseconds, and a slower decay up where about 90% of the decay happens by 200 femtoseconds. So these timescales are definitely faster than for the monomer, but this is partially due to the fact that the energy is closer between the second and the first excited state here. So now if we look at the atomic vibrations, what we see is that the atoms are sort of having these coherent motions between the atoms. And what we see is that when we look at the transition density, and I should say this is for one of many trajectories that were sampled in this non-adiabatic dynamics approach, what we see is that while the exciton starts out delocalized, it starts to localize as the excited state decays to the first S1. So it sort of starts out delocalized, stays delocalized for a while, and then it starts to kind of hop back and forth between the top and the bottom molecule once it has localized in the S1. So this suggests to us that over the dynamics, those intramolecular vibrations are kind of dominating and localizing the exciton. But I just want to note that other studies that we've done on an infinite wire, which is fictitious, which we made up and has not been synthesized, what we find is that when we have an infinite wire, that the dominant intermolecular modes are intermolecular that couple to the excited state. And so we maintain that delocalization. So it may be that as we start to stack more and more molecules, that we're not going to see this localization of the excited state. And with that, I'd like to conclude to say that we use these bio-inspired PDIs as a model system to understand exciton-phonon interaction, exciton dynamics when we stack pi-conjugated molecules. And what we found is that ground state vibrations are very important, and so are degeneracies in excited states. And also that intermolecular phonons can couple to the exciton state, and that excited state dynamics so far show that that delocalized exciton is actually localizing. So I just want to acknowledge the students who worked on this, Alia Mukjanova, who was the leading these projects, and Jing Trera Yapiwat, who worked on the Frank Condon studies, and also our collaborators, Alan Gorodetsky, Sergei Tretiak's group, and also NSF for funding. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the great talk. Yeah, Chris?
Yeah, very nice. And you've inspired a bunch of questions. The first one will be a private question. With MD sampling, you are not at equilibrium. So how can you calculate the Frank Condon factors if you're taking them from non-equilibrium structures? I think I'm sort of paraphrasing the question.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So basically, we're going to a local minimum rather than the global minimum. And the reason that this happens is because when we have these structures for the stacked molecules, there's a sort of flat potential energy surface in terms of the ground state, because you know, as the molecules sort of slightly move with respect to each other, the energies don't change very much because they're dominated by van der Waals interactions. So when we do the Frank-Condon analysis, we go to a local minimum, so we don't have negative frequencies or anything like that, but we're not at the global minimum of the ground state.
Mhm. Okay, I'm gonna now skip Suggy's question, go to Doran Bennett's question, which is basically for the monomer, the calculated monomer spectrum. Why was there a discrepancy between in the absorption, the overestimate of the first vibronic peak?
So we actually found that if we exactly do ground state Frank-Condon, so we include ground state vibrations as well as excited state, that goes away. So that's one reason. Also, if we change the functional, that changes. So, but I think it's really because of the ground state vibrations.
Okay, and then another question on vibrations from Naomi, which was sort of partially addressed by Suggy, which is again this question of the, why do the intermolecular modes protect the coherence while the intramolecular modes destroy it? You sort of addressed that at the end of your talk, but maybe you can amplify on that a little bit.
So basically what we find is that when we have the intramolecular modes, you sort of break the symmetry between the two molecules. And so one becomes more energetically favored than the other for the excited state to localize on. But the intermolecular modes, because the molecules are moving either in a correlated way or maybe they're anti-correlated and coming together, then that actually either doesn't impact the electronic coupling or maybe makes it stronger when it's together. But there are some cases that we found where you have intra and intramolecular modes, and then it's sort of not really clear what happens. I can't make a generalization about those sort of multiple excitations, multiple vibrational excitations.
Okay, and then the next question from Sean Roberts is basically asking you to kind of make a generalization about, is there a particular type of intermolecular motion that has a stronger impact? What's the best type of intermolecular motion, and do motions that change the PDI spacing versus slip displacement have different impacts? So in other words, if the molecules are going like that versus like that, can you say anything about what's the right type of intermolecular motion?
So my guess would be that it will have an impact, but we haven't done that analysis, but that's a great idea for analysis that we should do.
Okay. Okay, and then I had a question which I did not write in the chat. So there's, thank you, Sahar. Actually, we'll go back to Suggy's question. Can the red portion be the contribution of monomers? Again, he's talking about your calculated absorption spectra for the, for the dimer and trimer. And you had that red shifted part of the absorption spectrum, which I think was not well described by the theory. Yeah, so or say slide 10.
Mm-hmm.
And couldn't that red portion be ascribed to the dimers? Or sorry, to monomers.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, localized monomers.
Mm-hmm.
So I think based on the experimental confidence that when they say dimer, that they've purified and they know that they have a dimer. I think everything that they measure should be a dimer. They're pretty confident about that. Whether you might have certain sort of uncoupled dimers, in the solution, that could be something. But I think as far as they understand, they really are able to purify it.
Okay, yeah, I had a question about this because it looks like the chat's clearing out. But that it's a big change in the amount of oscillator strength that you calculate, and these are all first principles calculations. You don't have any sort of wiggle room to add oscillator strength. But it seems like, do you really think that a vibronic, but that just different conformations would give you a factor of 10 in the oscillator strength of that red shifted feature, which I assume is due to, a true dimer state, J-type coupling? Or is there something, is there some electronic feature that's missing to describe that?
So I guess our experience, we could only do full Frank-Condon, with the finite temperature and the ground state for the monomer. And our experience was that this peak, this, this high peak kind of went down to match the experiment very well. So it did definitely impact the oscillator strength of the second peak to do that. And significantly, but not as significantly as what I'm showing here. So I think, I guess I'm not sure is probably the best answer, because I think we have H-like stacking is what we find and what the MD simulations find. And so we might expect a dark low energy peak. So why it sort of shoots up in the experiment, sort of, you know, maybe it's that the ground state vibrations are really sort of impacting that, this coupling between a ground state vibration and excited state vibration based on how the molecules are rotated. You know, that's one sort of hypothesis that we had. And, you know, we're only doing 100 MD structures, so maybe not all of them will be H-like if we really sample 1,000 or something. So, you know, there's some uncertainty because the sort of energetic landscape here in terms of the ground state is so flat that, you know, there's some uncertainty as to whether we have the best sampling. But I guess I agree with your point that you know, if they're all H-like, you know, if you never break that H-like aggregation, then it seems unlikely that this is going to just shoot up just based on ground state vibrations. Yeah, so I'm not sure what the answer is.
Did they measure the fluorescence spectrum? Is it strongly emissive?
I believe they did for the monomer and the dimer.
Okay.
And it was emissive. Yes.
Okay. So that's also may suggest that maybe you do have some J-type coupling there that's sort of being missed. Okay, and then are we still on the +4 minute, Suggy, or are we back to?
Yeah, still we are on +4 minutes, but unless there is additional question, I think
there is one additional question from John Bender, which is how does the effect of intermolecular vibrations change increasing from dimer to trimer? What are in other words, are the charge transfer excitation mixing in play here, and how does that affect the functional? How is that affected by the functional that you're using? So that's sort of a long question.
Going from the dimer to the trimer, in general, we find that the intermolecular coupling weights go up compared to intramolecular weights, but that's not for every structure, just in general. In terms of how it's affected by the functional, we haven't done tests on the functional for these dimers and trimers, so I can't say. We use the omega B97 XD because we expect that it will be able to describe charge transfer excitations because of that long range corrected behavior. And also it has van der Waals interaction, so we expect that it's going to be able to describe those intermolecular vibrations appropriately. So we feel that it's a reasonably good functional for this system, but we haven't tested others for the stacks.
Okay. And then there are sort of two suggestions that came up on the chat. One was from David McCammett, who thought that maybe, basically better sampling would give rise to less of the pi stacked conformations, and that might explain the redshifted feature. And then David Casanova suggested that maybe there's more of a charge transfer interaction that could lead to J-type coupling. That I don't know if that would be accurately, you know, maybe you're missing part of that, I guess, in terms of your calculations. But basically the intermolecular, you know, there's these arguments about charge transfer versus non-charge transfer type interactions.
So I think with this functional, we should be able to describe charge transfer excitations. So is the question about whether we're missing charge transfer excitations or that they're...
Well, I think this is paraphrasing David Casanova, but I think he's, you know, there's sort of these ideas also from Frank Spano that you can have something that maybe looks like an H-type aggregate or should be an H-type aggregate in the Kasha model, but if you factor in charge transfer interactions, that can actually switch the sign, the net sign of the exciton interaction.
So I feel pretty good about this functional in terms of getting the charge transfer character, but I do agree that from Frank Spano's model, you know, you can change sort of the orientation just a little bit, and then you get sort of J-like with an H-like sort of orientation. So I agree that that could be something in terms of just maybe, you know, we have this kind of orientation, but if in the system you have a little bit like tilting or something like that, that you might get more J-like.
Okay, and with that, I think now we're at 9:04, so we're keeping to our 4 minutes. So Sahar, thank you very much for an awesome talk.